have David Gerard Matthews with us today, who's going to show us his Ondea, which is a modern take on the Ondes Martenot.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thanks, Ross, for inviting me. So, the Ondes Martenot, by the way, I'm going to be using a lot of French terminology. I know we have native speakers here. I apologize. It's been a long time since my high school French class. and the French that I've used most recently has been in Quebec, where I think their accents are probably a little non-standard. But so, the Ondes Martenot, the original version of it was invented in 1928 by Maurice Martenot. They were only ever produced in Martenot's workshop. He never commercialized it at all. Every one of them was hand-built. There were only about 400 or so ever made in the course of about 60 years. The very last instruments came out of his workshop in 1927. Martenot himself was deceased by that time, but his assistants had managed to keep the workshop going for a while, and then they retired, and that was that. Incidentally, the very last two that came out of his workshop went to Quebec, Montreal. One of them is owned by my teacher, Geneviève Grenier, and the other one is owned by a friend and colleague of hers. So there were 6 models produced. What you see in that picture there is the Model 6, which is kind of one of the most famous ones. The earliest versions only had a ribbon, which I'll show you what that looks like shortly. The final model was transistorized. Earlier models were tube-based, and it was a very, very quirky use of tubes, from what I understand. I am not an expert on tube technology, but from talking to some folks who are experts on tube technology, Martenot's uses of it was very idiosyncratic and hard to reproduce. Okay, so, however, the last decade or so, there have been some new instruments of this type produced, one of which you see in front of you. This is my instrument. It is not an antique. Jean-Luc Dierstein in Paris, who is known as the synth tech for Vangelis and Daft Punk and Air and all of those French synth groups, has been building them for the last 20 or so, 15 or so years. He was originally bankrolled on that project by Johnny Greenwood from Radiohead. Naoyuki Omo in Japan is building something called the Ondomo, which is a smaller, more compact instrument. And then David Keane is building the Ondea, which is a slightly different version. That is the instrument that I own. He is based in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and we'll talk a little bit more about the Ondea and what makes it different from a classic Ondes Martenot in a bit. So they are being made again, but there was a period of about 30 years when there were no new Ondes Martenot type instruments being produced. So some history. The earliest version had only the ribbon controller and this button that we call a touche. So Martenot, a little backstory here. He was trained as both a musician and an engineer. Probably like most of us in the room, he was equally interested in music and technology. In 1916, when he was drafted into the French army in World War I, of course, the cutting edge technology was radio. And they thought, oh, you're an electrical engineer and a musician. We're going to make you a radio operator. And he used to entertain the other troops by messing around with the radio frequency and trying to play tunes on it. So kind of like, whoops. All right. Well, somewhere along the line, he had the idea of connecting a ribbon controller to the frequency tuner on a radio. The theremin was also invented around the same time. Problem with the theremin, of course, is does anybody here play the theremin? Yeah, I figured we probably had a few theremin players in the house. Well, of course, the problem that he saw with a theremin was that it was hard to get discrete pitches and to articulate. So he had this idea of having a switch that would interrupt the pitch. And so on all of the early instruments up until the very end, the touche is actually has a bag full of graphite. And there's an electrode on either side. And of course, the more you press, the harder you press the button, the more current flows through the graphite, and that gets you your voltage control. Incidentally, it's not pure graphite. It was made from this proprietary mixture that Maurice Martenot took to his grave, and David Keane, who built my instrument, had to reverse engineer what actually is in this bag, because as I mentioned, it was not pure graphite. It was doped with like a bunch of other things. Yeah, I think there's a little lead. There was actually talcum powder and ground up cork to make it springy. Newer instruments do not use that. That's a Hall effect sensor on mine. But originally, that's what he had. All you had was this draw ribbon, and if you saw in the picture, you actually played by pulling the ribbon closer and further apart than you. 1931, he introduced a fake keyboard. So that's actually not just a real keyboard, it's just a piece of wood with keys painted to serve as a pitch reference. Eventually, it acquired the keyboard that we have today alongside the ribbon. The thing that makes the keyboard special and the point of the thing that it has in common with the Continuum controller, aside from the ribbon, the keyboard, and I'll after we're done here, I'll swap the instrument around. You can all see. The keyboard actually swivels. Oops. Maurice Martenot was a cellist, and he could not live without his pitch bends and vibrato. The earliest instruments did not have the full keyboard. They just had this painted one. This is an instrument that's in the museum in Paris. It's got an Art Deco style cabinet. You note the ribbon that travels along the surface here. In the 1930s, he actually introduced a keyboard into like a full functional keyboard, as I just described. This was a performance that was done in 1937 at the Paris Exposition. You can see there's an ensemble of Ondes Martenot. And the performers are mostly women. That is where they played the Fête de Bellone that Oraison is taken from, yes. So this is probably an instrument similar to that. This is a Mark IV, serial number 44. It has a true keyboard. Okay, so this is a Mark V. This is probably the instrument that people, when people think of the Ondes Martenot, which I don't know how many people think of the Ondes Martenot much, but I mean, I've been thinking about it since I was 14, but you know. How old am I? It's been over 30 years, we'll put it that way. Okay. This instrument was based on the tube oscillator's amplifier. By the way, traditionally in Ondes Martenot usage, the instrument itself is powered and puts out speaker level signal, which is also the case here. I have line outputs as well, but these speakers are being driven by an amplifier in there. It is not tube-based. But on the classic sort of Messiaen Ondes Martenot, if we want to call it that, this is that instrument. It was used by Messiaen and others, built sometime between the 1940s and 1960s. And there are still some of them left. They don't mostly work. So notable uses of the Ondes Martenot, of course, most famously Olivier Messiaen, the great French composer, used it in a number of pieces. The Fête de Belle Eau, which is the famous piece that he wrote in 1937 for 6 Ondes Martenot that was performed at the Paris Exposition. Trois Petites Liturgies, which is a piece for Ondes Martenot, piano, percussion, string orchestra, and female voices. The famous Turangalila Symphony, and his opera about St. Francis. Edgar Varese, the piece Equatorial, which was originally written for this curious instrument called a fingerboard theremin. I know nothing about this. I don't know if anybody here knows anything about it.
Like Randy Theremin cello?
Yeah, that's it.
Floyd, what's
Floyd
the name?
Okay. Okay, so the Varese Equatorial was originally written for that instrument, but because there, I guess, are even fewer of those than there are Ondes Martenot, it was rescored for Ondes Martenot at some point. Tristan Muraille, who is a contemporary user of it, he is a composer who for a long time taught at Columbia University in New York, but I think he's retired from that and went back to France. He is also notable as a virtuoso ondiste. He's recorded Turangalila a bunch of times. He's also recorded it. The Ghostbusters score, if you go back and watch the original Ghostbusters movie, the Ondes Martenot, played by Cynthia Miller, is all over that. And then, of course, Radiohead are kind of like responsible for like spearheading a lot of the revival of this instrument. Johnny Greenwood from Radiohead, much like me, discovered the Turangalila Symphony at 14. And when he became a rock star, he went out and bought one. He wanted another one to take on tour, couldn't find one at any price, and so he just had Jean-Luc Dierstein build him one. Must be nice. Okay, so here's a couple of videos I was going to show, but I'll just play for you. But there's some, and I'll send you these links. There's a couple of, it's an interesting performance of the Turangalila Symphony. If you don't know that piece, that's kind of the thing that has kept ondistes in business for the last 60 years. Every major orchestra does it once a decade or so, and they need an ondiste to come and play it. There's a video of Radiohead playing How to Disappear Completely with 6 Ondes Martenot in Paris, so it's kind of an interesting performance. And then Tristan Muraille, La Conquête Antarctique.
Who's that? Murray?
Muraille. Tristan Muraille, yeah.
And I say, okay.
Yeah, very interesting composer associated with what's the spectral, yeah, the French spectral school. Yeah. Okay. So, what does it sound like? Well, so I'm going to just play a little Bach. Sorry about the little memory slip in there. You can see the keyboard is monophonic. It does have low note priority. A friend of mine wrote a piece for 3 of these instruments that was all about that, all about like building polyphony from the low note priority. So it was a lot of love. And we do have different timbres here. So this is sort of the classic Ondes. Timbre is basically just a sine wave, like a tweaked sine wave. The cru is like a square wave, sort of. The gambe is supposed to sound like a viola da gamba. And then, of course, you can mix them. There's also a white noise generator, which usually it's mixed with. And then we have various transposer buttons. So there's a transposing button for up a fifth, up a third, up a whole step, half step, and a quarter tone. And another odd little feature here is the, I don't know what this is. This is called just the grave and the aigu. So this just like transposes up by a random amount. It's like some kind of weird sample and hold thing. I have no idea why this was included in the instrument, but Maurice Martenot had an idea to put that in there at some point, and so there it is.
So this is a tube oscillator inside this?
This is not a tube oscillator. The classic on Martenot was a tube oscillator. This actually is built around a very basic analog synth oscillator. It actually uses the classic Curtis chips. Yeah, the tube oscillator, so the original Ondes was built on a heterodyning tube oscillator similar to a theremin. But Martenot's, I mentioned earlier, Martenot's tube design was apparently very eccentric. I know that I've known some people who have tried to like reverse engineer and figure out like what exactly he was doing there, and I think they've mostly figured it out, but he used a lot of very unusual, very rare tubes, including one that like looks like an Edison light bulb, and like, you know, it's impossible to find anywhere. Like, so eventually he abandoned that. I think it got to be too difficult to maintain, and he went solid state sometime in the 70s. The newer instruments follow suit. I don't really think it's lacking in any warmth on account of that. Now, part of it is these speakers, and this is one of the reasons I use these speakers. These speakers have a lot of roll-off, and that helps give it that sort of warm sound. If you just throw it through a DI box and just listen to the just raw output, there are a lot more harmonics going on. These speakers cut off around like 8K or so, which is kind of part of the characteristic sound of the instrument. When I record, I do use a tube. Well, I use a DI box in general, and I've started using a tube one. Anyway, so I thought I'd show you also a little bit about the ribbon, which is kind of the most famous thing about it. This is a little thing that was actually originally written for this instrument by the composer Darius Milhaud. And this is kind of the most famous feature of the instrument, of course, is the ribbon controller. Thank you. So that was a, yes.
A switch for switching between the ribbon and the...
Yes. So I don't know if you can see on the button here, which we call this the tiroir. Did I do it right? Did I do okay? Is that, yeah, tiroir? Okay, thank you. Merci. So it's, if you notice the C, there's a C up here for clavier, and B down here for bag, which is what we call this thing. They also call it the ruban. But, so this is what, to switch back and forth. There is a very common technique of playing on the keyboard while you've still got your finger in the ribbon, so you can switch back and forth very quickly. I will admit I have not mastered it.
Can you just show, even though you might not, can you just show what it's like to do it?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, we want to embarrass you.
Yeah.
Sure. I assume I'm among friends here.
Okay, we'll get the idea.
Okay. So, for example, I could be playing along here. Yeah. I know, as I mentioned earlier, so that's the other interesting thing. Of course, the keyboard, I can be playing along all I want. Nothing is happening because I haven't hit the touche. So this is really the soul of the instrument. It controls all of your dynamics and articulation. The other thing is, notice I'm not doing anything with my left hand, right hand. It has like a sample and hold, so it remembers the last pitch that you've been playing, as well as being low note priority. The pedals, yes. Okay, so this one is like a substitute for the touche, because sometimes if you're playing really fast things, it's useful to have both hands free. This one, so this is a filter, but it's a very, very subtle filter. So that's why I'm going to turn everything on here so you can actually hear if it does anything. But if you're expecting like a big Moog filter, it's not that. So. I mean, you can hear it's cutting something off. It's a lot, that one actually is a little more obvious if you're going direct into a line level source. You can hear that a little bit more, but it's a very, very subtle filter. And you know, I've got all of these engaged. The D 1 through 4, D is for diffuseur. It refers to the speakers, so D1 is normally just a general normal speaker cabinet. D2 is usually dedicated for the reverb. Now, I haven't talked about the specialized cabinets because I don't own any, but if you look at pictures of the classic Ondes Martenot, you'll very often see this thing that looks like they call it the palm. It's like this sort of heart-shaped thing with sympathetic strings on it. It's got a transducer and sympathetic strings. Now, those have not really been successfully revived. David Keane, who built my instrument, has some prototypes that he's been working on, but he actually had to like work with like a luthier like to get it right, and like getting the exact dimensions of it correct is very difficult. And then it's very quiet. Like the originals are very quiet. People nowadays want it to be a lot louder. So like that's been a lot of work on that aspect. In my case, since I don't have a palm, D2 is just the cabinet down there, which is a reverb channel. And I've actually got some onboard reverb here. On this instrument, it is digital. This one is a prototype. When I first got it, I had an external spring reverb box. And then I had the digital reverb added to it with a later revision. D3 would historically have been the gong speaker. You might see some pictures of that. Some folks are starting to build those. They were not really available when I bought mine, but they are available now. And there's also a plugin for it that I'm using these days sometimes. D4 would not have existed on a traditional lawn. They only had 3 outputs, but I have a 4th one that's where I plug direct outputs in. This instrument also has MIDI and CV on board, which of course did not exist in the 1930s. CV, of course, would have been available by the 1970s, but Martenot never added it. I don't use it that much personally because if I were to drive anything analog with it, it would probably end up being a fairly similar timbre anyway. I do use it as a MIDI controller sometimes, but more often if I'm doing something with it with MIDI, it's because I'm taking some output and doing something strange with Max with it, like not just, as a controller. The one exception is, since these keys are very lightweight and they're kind of narrow, one of my other big obsessions is Baroque music, and playing harpsichord samples on a weighted keyboard just doesn't feel right. So it's a great controller for like harpsichords or organs, but of course, that's not why you have an Ondes Martenot. Yeah, Russ?
So the MIDI out is polyphonic then?
The MIDI out is polyphonic, yes. The MIDI out is polyphonic. And touch sensitive. Yes, the other interesting things is that these keys are also pressure sensitive, but not on the internal oscillator. They will transmit pressure data on the MIDI output. However, it is not currently MPE compatible because that was sort of like up and coming when they were designing this version of the instrument, and that would have required a firmware update that, it's just like a 2-person team. They haven't really implemented yet. But now having said that, I've got all these pedals here. So yeah.
How does the CV router, is it like, is it sending one voltage amplitude from the touche and then pitch from the ribbon?
Yeah, so I have 2 CV outs. One is, and they're just bog standard pitch is coming off of the keyboard or ribbon, and gate off of the touche.
Gate off. Oh, but how does that, so.
No, actually, okay, I lied. It's not just gate. It is, it's like VC. It's sorry?
Oh, no, sorry. It's just note on for MIDI, but the CV, it's just a gate?
No, sorry. I missed it. So it's labeled gate on here, but that's actually not what it is. It would be what you would use to drive a VCA.
Right, it's progressive.
Yeah. It is.
We do the similar thing on the, a lot of people just use a gate, but you can actually set the amplitude of the gate for all sorts of things.
Yeah. Similar idea, yeah. I mean, it is amplitude. It's actually labeled gate on here, I think, but it's what you would use to, you could use it to just drive a gate if you wanted, I guess, but like I said, I honestly don't use the CV outs that much because what I'm going to demonstrate here, this thing takes pedals very well, and I found that it's kind of, I do own a modular synth, and I've tried patching it into the modular, and I found that it doesn't track the oscillator that well, and so I found it's kind of more interesting. Like if I wanted to do something that's really like pitch sensitive, I'm just going to use the MIDI out. If I'm wanting, yeah.
Oh, I just, it looked to me in your performance like you were sustaining a note on the low part of the keyboard, not playing it, but was I misinterpreting that?
So if you're referring to like when I was playing the Bach? Yeah. Okay.
There was a low note sounding that I didn't think you were playing.
So I might have, so I wasn't using the pedal there, but that's a thing I could do. I think maybe the one thing that is a very common technique that I do a lot of is you hold down a key and then release it while you're, to take advantage of the low note priority.
It was like a note in the bass range. Maybe you were playing it with your finger and I didn't see it.
Yeah, the other thing is the touche does the articulation.
Oh, that might be what you're referring to.
Oh.
Okay.
Sustains after you play.
Yes. Now, actually, that's another interesting point. The original earliest on Martenots did not work that way. That was a feature that was added sometime in probably the 60s. But by that point, there were people that had come up that had gotten used to playing without it. And I guess if you're used to that, it's very, very difficult to adapt to not having that. So I have an option to turn that off, which makes it a lot harder for me to play. My teacher used to give me exercises to play with this off. Now, she also does not play with this disengaged, but it's a good exercise. So I mean, if I try to disengage it and then try to play, it's like, you hear that clicking? Now, me being me, I take that to my advantage, and sometimes I leave that on and I use it as a percussive effect, which is not what it was intended to do. But you know, you can play with it off, and some people play beautifully that way.
So it remembers the volume that the touche was at when you lifted off the last note?
No, it doesn't remember the touche, it remembers the pitch.
Oh, okay.
So if I let go of the touche,
Without it, you know,
if I let go of the touche, the
Is
sound
it just
will
like a
stop.
pitch of zero, like when it's not remembering it, it's silent because the pitch is zero, theoretically zero? Or?
The amplitude is 0.
Yeah, don't worry about it.
Oh, I'm sorry. When it's not remembered, yes, you are correct. I'm sorry. I was misunderstanding your question.
Doesn't have a pitch.
David, if
Yes.
you tap that touche, it's like a note, how percussive can you get it?
You can get very percussive. Yes.
Like fingers, like triplets, if you go.
I'm not asking what you turn it. See, when he plays it right now,
Yep.
it's coming in from.
It's not really like rapid repeated notes aren't really its thing. Like some people have gotten very good at that, but that's not really idiomatic. You know, much more so idiomatic are fast tremolos. And of course, there's a trick of, you know, just sending the reverb return and then playing very fast tremolos to get fake polyphony.
So the whole key bed wiggles back and forth, that's what you're using for vibrato?
Yeah,
I didn't mention that. So what's the
Yep.
range of that band? Can you control that?
It's about a half step.
There's no option to go to 96?
No. Well, actually, if you want to get nerdy about that,
We do.
I figured this crowd probably would. One feature that the Ondes has that, to my knowledge, no other model of Ondes Martenot, current or past, actually has had, is I can set this to non-equal temperaments. And for the curious out there, mine lives in Werkmeister. Yeah, and to my knowledge, no other no, that's not true. Maurice Martenot was very interested in Indian music, and he did build a couple of instruments in his lifetime with scales adapted to Indian temperaments. I don't know if any of those instruments are still extant, and I think there were only 2 or 3 ever built. But to my knowledge, that's the only time before the Ondes that anybody has built an Ondes Martenot with non-equal temperament in mind, although the quarter tone bend function has been included since maybe not the very beginning, pretty early on.
So do you tune it on the inside, or is there like a pot for each key, or does it always divide?
Okay, so actually, I'm lucky on this one because there's a global, I'm going to flip it around, I'll show you. There's a global tuning for the keyboard and for the ribbon. This instrument, because it's more recent, does have a digital microcontroller to control the oscillators. That does have to be tuned though. So there's a procedure that when I first got it, I went and had to tune each of the pitches, and the keyboard doesn't need to change that much. Apparently, the ribbon, people have different curves that they use based on their playing. So like once I kind of got used to it, I did retune all the procedure on the ribbon, which was kind of a long and complicated process, but.
The problem with there's the French Connection, which is the analog systems version, just a CD keyboard.
Right.
It does the same thing. And the problem with that is that I have not encountered any one of them where the switch between the keyboard and the ring did not re-pitch the oscillator.
Interesting.
So
Yeah.
it would like be a quarter step off, and you'd have to retune
Oh.
going back and forth, which
Huh.
made it unfortunately useless.
Yeah, I've never actually seen one of those in the flesh. I was reading about.
It's great fun.
Yeah.
And you use the touche and do that with a keyboard, or you can use the touche and use it with a ribbon, but you can't like switch back and forth with them easily.
Oh, that's frustrating.
And I wrote to Bob about it, and he was like, "Yeah, that's still they're." I said, "Is there any calibration?" He's, "Nope, that's it. You have to mechanically change it."
Oh, that's frustrating. Yeah. Luckily, I don't have that problem. The other thing is, this is only it's missing an octave compared to like an 88-note keyboard, but I do have an octave down. Oops.
Turn it up a little.
Oh. And yeah, the bass on this thing is great. Like everybody thinks about the ethereal high stuff in Messiaen, but the bass on this thing is, you can get all dubsteppy as you want. Yeah, it's also got a switch to hit up in the very high frequency range. So, oops. I will spare everyone's ears by by not playing any higher than that. But I could if I wanted to. So anyway, the Ondes, of course, is not just for playing Messiaen or Mio or even Radiohead. So I've kind of gotten into processing it in various ways. Thanks. That was actually not the reverb program I hoped it would have been, but that's okay. Okay, so I'll just flip this keyboard around here so you can have a look. But any other things anybody wants to know? Yeah.
The multiple transpose buttons, is
Yep.
that a feature of the original?
So I don't think that would have been something on maybe the very earliest versions, but I can tell you that the 1980s Ondes Martenots that I played had it. I think that probably came around either the Mark V in the 1950s or the Mark VI in the 60s or 70s. So yeah, that is something that was part of the instrument from fairly early on. Most of the features that are on this instrument were things that were around fairly well. Anything that was okay, I should rephrase this. Anything that would have been on a 1960s Ondes Martenot, I have, and then some. Because they wanted, they want to be able to play the repertoire that calls for that. The only thing that is kind of odd is if you look at some of the music that's written for this instrument, like I'll have these number codes, like this one says 257. That refers to settings on the oscillators on the older models, but nobody really knows what that means in a modern context. The best we can do, because at some point they changed from having the oscillator combinations being numbered to having these descriptive terms like nasal and creux. And nobody really knows that's still around knows what the connection between the numbers and the letter codes that we now use is, so you have to listen to old recordings and try to figure it out.
That, you mentioned there was some switches like D1, D2.
Mm-hmm.
Are those discrete outputs from it?
They are discrete outputs.
So originally they would have been hooked up to these specialty resonators.
Correct.
But you could put them, is that like an effects loop?
Yeah, so the way that mine is set up, I have 4 speaker level outputs that are D1 through 4. I only ever use 2 because I only have 2 speakers. I also have 4 line level outputs, except not today because I didn't bring the cable for that. But the 4 line level outputs duplicate the 4 speaker level outputs. In addition, I have an insert on the D1 so that all of my pedals here go into this insert. So the signal path goes line level out through the insert into my pedals, line level return back into the instrument through the power amp to the D1.
So it's possible you could set up individual outputs, process them separately, and control, basically gate them on and off on the keyboard from the Martenot itself.
Yes. Yes, I could. And I have individual level control here. Now it's interesting because the faders on this are the classic like old school reverse where like down is all the way. Oh yeah. And up is nothing. Yes, so I have what I do in my home studio is I have my speaker cabinets here and I mic them up, and then I have D3 as a send through a DI box. And then in a performance situation, I didn't bring any digital processing today because I figured we had enough of that going on here. But what I'll often do is have D3 or D4 going into an audio interface, and I'll process that in Max, or these days usually Super Collider. And I can control the level of that through there. Yep. And often, actually, what I'll do is I'll have D3 going into a mixer and have, you know, whatever other synths or modular instruments I want on that, and then have the reverb as an effect send off of that.
The octave spacing, is that like a traditional piano?
No.
So it's narrower.
It's narrower. Yeah, it's narrower because since you usually only have one hand, it makes it easier to grab those wide leaps. And let me tell you, it's actually very frustrating to go back and forth between this.
Finger memory or-
To the point where I've almost completely stopped playing the piano because like it just drives me crazy. That's incidentally, I mentioned that I do use it as a controller for Baroque music. That's one of the reasons it works well for that, because if you've ever played a harpsichord, the keys are narrower. The original Ondes Martenots that Maurice Martenot was building, I believe he was using accordion keys. I could be wrong on that, but I think they're accordion keys. But once again, they were like the keys that he was getting from some specialized manufacturer in France, and they're not the same size. Like my wife plays the accordion, and like the keys on it are not the same width as this.
There's a fairly standardized accordion spacing?
I think there is a fair. I don't know. I'm not an expert on accordions, but I think that is fairly standardized. But I think the Ondes Martenot keys were not quite that. These keys were made by a manufacturer who specializes in keyboards for pipe organs, and I believe they are custom to.
Made of what?
They are made of wood, yeah. Now, on a classic Ondes Martenot, they are not wood. A vintage Ondes Martenot, they are plastic keys.
Can I ask what David in Calgary sells these units for?
I believe new they are around 12 grand US. Mine was not that much because it's basically a prototype, and I was working with him on it. I believe he still does build them, and I believe they are called custom built, for the individual. I didn't really talk about my history with this, but the short version is I was about 14 years old. I used to go comb the records selection at the local library. There was a copy of the Messiaen Tarangalila Symphony. I brought it home. It blew my mind. I wanted to play the Ondes Martenot. I was a teenage oboe player. Was my main instrument. There were no Ondes Martenots anywhere in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Later on, many years after that, around 2012, a friend of mine was presenting at a conference, actually much like this one. It was an electronic music conference in Montreal. I reached out to an ondiste there because I knew there were ondistes in Montreal, and said, I am fascinated with your instrument. Like, could I possibly see it? And she was very gracious, because I think everyone here can relate to this. People who are into unusual instruments love to talk about them. I think everyone in the room here can relate to that, right? Her name was Geneviève Crenier, and she was very gracious. She invited me over to her house to try her instrument and made me tea. And a few years after that, I applied for a grant from the Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council to go to Montreal and study with her. So I went up and spent a couple of weeks practicing the Ondes Martenot for 8 hours a day. And then we brought her here to Pittsburgh, and she played with the ensemble that I had at the time. But I still didn't own an instrument. And a few years after that, she mentioned that there was this guy in Calgary who was building the Ondea, and he was starting up production. And she put me in touch with him, and I ended up, buying this instrument about 7 years ago, and the rest is history.
Have you tried that Ondomo?
I have not tried the Ondomo. I looked into it around the time I was buying this instrument. I also explored the Ondomo, which was a newer instrument, and it would have been a lot less expensive. The reason I didn't go that route was because since it's only like a 4-octave keyboard, it would have required a lot of octave switching if you wanted to play like the older repertoire on it. If somebody was interested in the Ondes Martenot and wanted to use it just to play newer stuff or more experimental stuff, or didn't really want to play the classic Ondes Martenot repertoire at all, like, I would think that would be a perfectly, a perfectly valid choice. I talked to the guy who built it a little bit, and from what I understand, they're pretty cool instruments. It's certainly a lot more portable than this. But the big drawback there was that it's not really adapted towards the older repertoire. But that's what Johnny Greenwood tours with these days, I guess. So yep.
Do you know what the tuning for the sympathetic strings was?
Yes. So I don't know that it was ever fully standardized. I think most people just tuned it to a chromatic scale. But I don't even know that the octave was ever really standardized, which is one of the reasons why I don't think a lot of those palms are really in that great condition, because I think some people tried to get too much tension on them. I know that David Keane has been researching that pretty extensively, and I think he's got a system that he's working around, but because he is building them now, but that's a very recent development. And I don't know how much he's charging for that. But I know that there was a lot of back and forth research that went into that. Personally, I have had pretty good luck building digital resonators. Just building something in Max or Super Collider, or even just the stock resonators plug-in in Ableton Live. I've had pretty good luck simulating that effect. I suppose you could probably do something with convolution if you sampled one.
So have you tried one of these?
Have I tried one of those? I really, really wanted to try one of these, and we were going to plug me in, and I didn't bring my adapter that gets me line level out, because I didn't think I would need it today.
Well, I think they might let you do it if you want to.
Oh, we tried.
We tried.
Yeah.
I didn't. Yes, I actually think that one of those would probably be glorious.
Take the output going into one of your pedals?
So the problem is that that's just a send, and so there's a return that has to go back, to complete the circuit. So yeah, I know. We thought about that.
So you've never tried an Eowaves?
No, I haven't. Okay, Russ is calling time here. But,
Okay.
I'll be around though if anybody wants to come talk to me. I have not tried one of those, although I know some people that have. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I, for people that like synthesizers, there was a guy named Marcel Landowski that wrote an Ondes Martenot concerto in 1954. But you will definitely hear Joe Zawinul. Got some shit. Landowski. With an I.